Fire and wind come from the sky, from the gods of the sky. But Crum is your god. Crum, and he lives in the earth.
So this is my modest attempt to compare the 1982 film Conan the Barbarian to the 2023 film Dungeons and Dragons Honour Among Thieves. I went to the pictures recently to see Dungeons and Dragons, and it sort of inspired me to watch Conan again, and I forgot how much I loved that film. I just want to say at this part that it is a comparison, not a competition. I don't really feel anybody cares which film I preferred, and I don't really think they care to hear me tell them which film they prefer.
Enough talk!
Now, Conan is a film that takes its good sweet time to get started. Not a great deal happens in the opening sequences. There is a couple of narrations, monologue by Conan's father telling him about the riddle of steel, but it's interesting that you don't even see Arnold Schwarzenegger in the role of Conan till about quarter of an hour into the film, and Conan doesn't actually speak until the 23rd minute of the film.
Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of your women.
Dungeons and Dragons, on the other hand, is a way like shit off a shuffle. There's an introduction scene where Ed is introduced as the talker and Olga is introduced as the person who breaks kneecaps. Then there is the parole scene where you get 5 minutes or so of backstory with Ed narrating, and then they use a Birdman to escape from prison by using him as a hand glider. Now that the two films have their head, you'll find that they move at very different paces. Conan is a very contemplative film. It doesn't mind long scenes of just travelling or silence or running around with these great vistas of Conan's world. Dungeons and Dragons is much more concise though. They go from one scene with dialogue to another scene with dialogue to a scene to set up the plot to another scene with dialogue and action. Perhaps I got the ratio wrong a bit there, but certainly they don't let you settle down between scenes. The way the two films introduce their characters is also very different. Conan meets his first ally, Subutai, chained up to a wall outside of a witch's hut. And about the only thing Subutai says to him is, "I want food, and I'm an archer and a thief." Later on, when they're actually having the food, you have a little conversation about gods. Valeria they bump into outside the tower they're planning to burgle. She has some information about the tower, and that's it. Later on, she becomes Conan's love interest. It should be noted, though, that she is not some damsel in distress and is a very assertive character, and also a skilled fighter. Now, you could say that these characters have far less development in Conan, but at the end of the day, they don't really spend much time developing characters verbally in this film. You can more or less tell what Subutai and Valeria are like just by watching them. Now, this does mean that their history is something of a mystery, but whether this is a pro or a con is entirely down to the tastes of the viewer. A lot of people do prefer a little bit of ambiguity for their characters. Now, Dungeons and Dragons like to cram quite a bit of character development in there, which makes a long film seem very full, which is not a bad thing. Every character has an introduction scene and then an action scene where they assure their character, like the mage is an idiot and the Telflin can turn into an owlbear. And of course, we've already discussed Ed and Olga's entrance. And so we have a very full and concise history of about 5 characters, which is, again, a pro or a con depending on your tastes. It is interesting, though, that the film, which is based on the game, which is meant to exercise the imagination, leaves the least to the imagination. So it's fair to say that probably the target audience of Conan was a little bit more specific than Dungeons and Dragons, whereas Conan would perhaps appeal to the young lad who wants to wave a stick around and be built like a brick shithouse. Dungeons and Dragons casts a much wider net for audience appeal. You have much more than one type of character. You have gobshites, magicians, changelings. Basically what would make up a Dungeons and Dragons party in a Dungeons and Dragons game. Or at least that's what I imagine. I haven't actually played Dungeons and Dragons in 27 years. It has to be pointed out though that the barbarian fighter trope is used in Dungeons and Dragons in Olga's character, which Michelle Rodriguez does brilliantly. It is directly influenced by Conan, but then again all of the tropes in Dungeons and Dragons, or the vast majority at least, are borrowed from and then altered for the game and the films. And we must remember that everything for the Conan film was completely taken from the Conan books. Now, there are of course vast differences between the scenery and the special effects in Conan and Dungeons and Dragons, but this is perhaps a reflection of the technology available in 1982 and 2022. I do feel though that the director of Conan, whose name slips my mind at the moment, did want to go for a very earthy and immersive setting. Whereas the Dungeons and Dragons director, again, whose name completely eludes me, perhaps wanted a more spectacular effect. Now, the two villains in these two films are like the heroes in the same line of business. They're both wizards. Thulsa Doom, however, is a very underspoken wizard. He seems to rely on very little overt magic and more the power of mesmerization. The Red Mage, possibly due to the access to special effects, has much more overt powers, although essentially she can do the same as Thulsa Doom, which is to say she can control and kill large groups of people, which is of course quite dramatic and valuable to the plot. Now the two villains' temperaments are very different. Thulsa Doom is eloquent. He speaks gently. He doesn't lose his temper. Even when he's describing the transgressions Conan inflicted upon him, burgling his house, killing his pets, and what have you, he never loses his temper. But when he finds out he was the orchestrator of killing Conan's entire tribe, all he can see is, oh. The Red Mage, though, who is seemingly tried to play it coy, sees in disguise for a lot of the film, quite frankly, simmers with rage in every scene. She's not a very nice or approachable person. She's not trying to manipulate anybody. In fact, they have to get Hugh Grant's character in, possibly a lesser villain in this state, to do the manipulations for them, because she's quite frankly above it, in her eyes at least. Now, just before we come to the last section, I just want to quickly cover one little thing, which is the language used in both films. Which is not to say that they're both obviously speaking in English, but that Conan does make much more of an effort to sound like a fantasy film, whereas the more modern Dungeons and Dragons tends to use more modern parlance. Now, if I was a cynical man, I might be tempted to put this down to laziness, but I do actually think this is an attempt to appeal and relate to more audiences. Now, the final thing I'd like to look at is the combat, and it is fairly par for the course. Dungeons and Dragons is quite visually spectacular and flamboyant. It makes great use of modern technology, and it's a pleasure to watch. Conan's is much more grounded, and the combat is much more brutal and direct. Which is interesting though, as even though Conan does feel like a more violent film, there are far less combat scenes. I think the main draw we can take from the combat scenes in the films is the emotional pitch that they try to create. In Dungeons and Dragons, they try to keep the jokes flowing and the atmosphere light during the fights. In Conan, the opposite is true. It's brutal and direct, usually trying to build suspense rather than humour. The most prominent comparison perhaps being when Olga was fighting off the guards who were going to execute her and Ed, while Ed kept up a flow of jokes, compared to the village raid at the beginning of Conan, where Conan's father tried to fight off the raiders while Conan's mother tried to escape with him. This is perhaps the most obvious example of one film trying to create a visual spectacle and another film trying to create an emotional reaction. Well, I hope that was alright for everybody. As you can probably tell, I'm not a video editor. It was perhaps a little bit of a rough job, but it was my first job and I did really feel like doing it. Again, there was some comparisons drawn, but I don't really want to start telling people what conclusions they should reach. Obviously, Dungeons and Dragons was the more visually spectacular, but more, shall we say, perhaps emotionally safe film, whereas Conan was something of the opposite. But it is entirely down to somebody which one they prefer. They're two completely different types of film. I think perhaps these days, when emotional health is a little bit more of an issue for most civilized societies, well, do you get uncivilized societies? You know what I mean? That films, more popular films, do tend to be safe. I do know, again, apologies for perhaps this not being the most professional job. It did take me weeks to get it this good, cramming it in between other projects. I will get back to my normal setup in the next video. Maybe do something about Chuck's coronation, the right to protest. That seems to be prevalent at the moment. And yeah, thanks for watching if you got this far. Yeah.